Beneath the roaring applause of the Colosseum, Rome's gladiators were more than entertainers. They were predators, performers, and pawns in a city that thrived on blood and secrecy. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the arena's spectacle ended, but their lives did not. Instead, a darker, hidden Rome came alive, a world where power, pleasure, and violence intertwined in ways the public could never imagine. In the shadows of taverns, alleyways, and illicit gatherings, gladiators navigated forbidden lusts, deadly rivalries, and a network of corruption that could destroy them faster than any lion or sword. Behind every smile, every favor, and every whispered deal lurked danger, and the line between survival and destruction was razor thin. This is the untold story of what truly happened when the crowds went home and the night consumed them. When the sun dipped below the jagged skyline of ancient Rome, casting long shadows across the stone teeth of the Colosseum, the roar of the crowd faded into memory, leaving only the echoes of violence and the metallic tang of blood hanging in the evening air, a smell so potent it could make a soldier gag even years after the fact. By day, this massive amphitheater, capable of holding over 50,000 Romans, men, women, and the occasional morally curious emperor, was a theater of death, a place where men and animals were slaughtered for entertainment, often with the precision of a surgeon and the cruelty of a tyrant. But when the crowds dissipated and the banners fluttered limp in the evening breeze, a different kind of life began to stir, one that the senators and spectators never intended to witness, a shadowed existence that made the arena's daily horrors seem almost quaint. Gladiators, those finely tuned killing machines sculpted from sinew and scars, were expected to sleep, eat, and train like soldiers during the daylight, their identities defined by the gory spectacles they performed. Yet, as night fell, the rigid discipline melted into a chaotic blur of appetites, vices, and desperate attempts at reclaiming humanity that the arena had so efficiently stripped from them. Behind the walls, the grandeur of Rome's architecture masked a seedy underworld, taverns that smelled of unwashed bodies and spilled wine, brothels that catered exclusively to men whose idea of romance involved the edge of a sword, and alleys where thieves and informants played a deadly game of cat and mouse. For the gladiators, this nocturnal world was not an escape, it was a necessity, a place to indulge instincts that were either too dangerous or too decadent to be allowed in public view. Consider the murmurs among historians. Juvenal, that master of Roman satire, hinted at the depravity lurking in the shadows of the city, painting the nights as a theater of vice that made the daytime carnage look almost tame. Archaeological finds from Pompeii and Herculaneum, including graffiti, inscriptions, and remarkably preserved artifacts, suggest a nightlife dense with eroticism, violence, and clandestine deals, a playground where gladiators, freedmen, and courtesans crossed lines that daylight morality pretended didn't exist. In fact, some gladiators were reputed to have earned more through their nocturnal exploits than by their bloody performances in the arena. A sobering irony considering how easily one could die under the gaze of the emperor or the jeering public. Money, pleasure, and power were traded in whispers and stolen moments, often with consequences far graver than a spear through the chest. The physicality of these men, trained to endure blows that would incapacitate ordinary humans, only made them more dangerous in the night, their presence commanding attention, fear, and desire in equal measure. Women, eager for the thrill of danger or perhaps simply for the status of intimacy with a man who could cleave another in half for sport, sought them out, sometimes as companions, sometimes as marks, and sometimes both. Wine and opium flowed freely in these dimly lit rooms, erasing inhibitions and creating chaos that could escalate into fights, robberies, or more intimate encounters that the historian might describe clinically, but which were undoubtedly messy, bloody, and morally ambiguous. Yet, beneath the debauchery and shadowy dealings, there was a human cost that Rome rarely acknowledged: loneliness, despair, and the gnawing awareness that every night spent in the throes of excess only postponed the inevitable return to the arena. For all their skill and bravery, gladiators were caught in a vicious cycle. oscillating between public adulation and private degradation, between life and the looming specter of death that the Colosseum promised with every sunrise. And as the torches flickered in the alleyways and the city's noises softened to an ominous murmur, one truth remained inescapable. While Rome slept, its most celebrated warriors lived in a darkness far more complex, far more human, and far more horrifying than anything the sunlit arena could contain. By the time the first lanterns dimmed and the moon hung like a silent overseer above the city, the Colosseum itself seemed to sigh, a giant exhalation of stone and history, as if even the walls were weary of the night's performances. The sun had set on the arena, but the shadows it left behind were alive, and they whispered secrets about the lives of men who killed for sport but survived for pleasure, men who were both gods and monsters in the city that worshipped them and would eventually forget them. Once the crowd's roar died down and the scent of blood mingled with dust settled like a suffocating fog over the Colosseum, the gladiators stepped out of the arena's harsh, unyielding embrace and into a city that seemed indifferent to their existence, a Rome that glittered with wealth and decadence by day but became a labyrinth of shadows, secrets, and raw human appetites by night, a place where reputation as killers offered both protection and peril, and where the line between survival and self-destruction blurred into something almost operatic in its intensity. Life beyond the sand was nothing like the meticulously choreographed spectacles of the arena. It was messy, unpredictable, and for those who knew how to manipulate it, profoundly lucrative. As gladiators discovered that fame could be leveraged for coin, favors, or access to pleasures that few Roman citizens could imagine without shame. Taverns, the dimly lit arteries of nocturnal Rome, became arenas of a different sort, where wit, intimidation, and physical prowess replaced swords and nets, though occasionally fists were thrown and bodies bruised in a smaller scale echo of the day's brutality. Here, men who could face lions without flinching haggled over the price of wine, engaged in duels of charisma with barmaids and patrons, or sought to drown the lingering taste of fear, death, and the roar of thousands in strong, often poisonous, alcohol. These taverns reeked of sweat, urine, and the lingering perfume of desperation, creating an intoxicating atmosphere in which gladiators thrived, prowling between tables like predators whose prey sometimes smiled at them, sometimes fled, but always watched with awe or envy. Some gladiators pursued romance or lust, though rarely anything resembling love. Relationships were transactional, performed with the precision of fight choreography, calculated to gain influence, money, or protection. Courtesans and prostitutes, some bound to patrons' whims, others surprisingly autonomous, found gladiators irresistible not merely for physicality, but for the aura of danger that clung to them like a second skin, a reminder of the arena where life and death were separated by the thinnest sliver of fortune. The interplay of power, desire, and survival often led to confrontations ending in betrayal, violence, or scandalous rumors spreading through Rome's gossip networks faster than a chariot on the Appian Way. Other gladiators, fewer in number, turned to less savory nocturnal professions. Gambling dens where fortunes were lost on dice or knucklebones. Illicit fighting pits mirroring the Colosseum, but small enough to escape magistrates' attention. And back alleys where bribes and threats determined the fate of both criminals and citizens alike. Here, the boundaries between legality and lawlessness dissolved, leaving only the brutal mathematics of advantage, reputation, and brute strength, a dark reflection of the public spectacle performed just hours before. Yet amid this chaos, a sense of structure persisted. Experienced gladiators knew when to exert force, when to charm, and when to retreat into shadow, their nights governed by instincts honed over years of training and arena experience. Despite the glamour or terror of these after-hours exploits, an undercurrent of fear persisted, a reminder that Rome could be as merciless as any lion or sword, and that a single mistake could turn fame into infamy, life into death. Gladiators carried this duality constantly, celebrated and feared in daylight, hunted and haunted at night. Fame, ironically, was both shield and target, attracting admirers and predators alike, making life beyond the sand a precarious tightrope, walked with the same concentration and risk as a fight for survival in the arena. Yet for all the danger, indulgence, and clandestine power plays, there was a peculiar, almost perverse allure to life beyond the sand, the chance to exist outside the arena's rigid rules, to taste freedoms the public could never understand, and to wield the influence earned from terror and skill in ways the emperor himself could not dictate. For these men, the city at night was as thrilling as the Colosseum, as terrifying, and infinitely more human, a reminder that gladiators were not merely tools of spectacle but creatures of flesh and ambition, capable of acts as shocking, depraved, and mesmerizing as any performed under the glaring sunday. And so, with the city as their playground, gladiators slipped into the shadows, leaving behind the sand-stained stones of the Colosseum, yet carrying its lessons, danger, and intoxicating allure into the tangled, dimly lit streets of Rome, where life beyond the sand was simultaneously more liberating, more dangerous, and far more morally ambiguous than any battle they could fight before the cheering masses. The streets of Rome after sundown were a kaleidoscope of shadow, torchlight, and the faint, ever-present stink of human excess, a nocturnal playground where gladiators slipped with the ease of predators into a world that was at once familiar and terrifyingly alien, a city that had cheered their every strike by day but demanded discretion, cunning, and subtlety by night, and where the pleasures they sought were as illicit as they were intoxicating, ranging from the decadent to the outright horrifying, each indulgence a gamble with fortune, law, and reputation, and a reminder that the city itself was a beast that fed on both innocence and corruption with equal appetite. For many gladiators, the forbidden pleasures began with the sensuous and illicit, shadowy rooms behind velvet curtains, where courtesans whispered promises in tongues as old as the empire, their touches precise, rehearsed, and designed to manipulate both body and mind, leaving men who had faced death daily trembling in ways no lion or net could ever elicit, as pleasure became weapon, bargaining chip, and self-indulgence, all at once, a dangerous triangle that could yield fortune or ruin with equal ease. These rooms, often hidden behind innocuous tavern doors or within the decadent villas of corrupt patricians, were perfumed with incense, sweat, and the faintest trace of blood, a subtle reminder that the arena was never truly far, that mortality hovered in every gasp and moan, and that the thrill of danger could be as arousing as the skillful hand of a lover or the calculated flick of a tongue. Others sought the darker, more morally ambiguous delights of Rome's nocturnal underworld, gambling dens where fortunes evaporated in the roll of dice, dens where coins, flesh, and pride were wagered with equal abandon, or shadowed courtyards where slaves and criminals enacted games as cruel and intricate as any the gladiators themselves had endured in the Colosseum, and where failure meant not applause, but pain, humiliation, or worse. Here, the night revealed a world of human appetites as raw and unpredictable as any beast in the arena, a landscape where trust was as dangerous as betrayal, and where indulgence was inseparable from risk, a visceral lesson in the price of desire that few could truly comprehend. Alcohol, always potent and sometimes spiked, with substances designed to heighten sensation or dull conscience, flowed freely, lubricating the interactions between gladiators, patrons, and the city's most elusive predators, turning simple flirtations into dangerous liaisons and playful dares into life-altering decisions, while the constant presence of shadow, both literal and metaphorical, reminded all participants that Rome's dark streets were unforgiving, that indiscretion could lead to exposure, and that the line between pleasure and perdition was thinner than the blade of a gladius. Even more forbidden and far more tantalizing were the whispered encounters with men and women whose names were never spoken outside the confines of these secretive spaces. Patricians who sought thrills beyond the proprieties of daylight, soldiers and freedmen willing to sell companionship or secrecy, and, sometimes, other gladiators whose reputations for violence extended into the realm of lust, creating an intricate web of desire, influence, and intimidation. A network where every glance, every touch, and every carefully timed word could mean the difference between empowerment and exploitation. And yet, amid these transgressions, there was a strange, intoxicating sense of freedom, a feeling that life beyond the Colosseum's sand was not simply survival, but the opportunity to taste humanity's darkest, most visceral pleasures without the constraints imposed by law, morality, or expectation. A reminder that even men forged in the crucible of death crave sensation, risk, and dominion over their fleeting mortal existence, and that for all its depravity, the night offered them something no arena could: the raw, unfiltered thrill of choosing how to wield their power and how to surrender to desire, even when it carried the stench of danger and doom. And so, guided by instinct, appetite, and the intoxicating shadows of forbidden pleasures, gladiators moved through Rome, as if the city itself were a labyrinth built for their indulgence, a place where every door promised ecstasy or agony, every shadow concealed danger or delight, and every heartbeat carried the weight of lives lived on the knife edge between life, death, and the seductive darkness that pulsed beneath the empire's glittering surface, a world in which the lessons of the arena found their most perverse and exhilarating expression after nightfall. Beneath the gilded streets of Rome, beyond the polished marble of patrician villas and the ever-watchful eyes of magistrates, existed a network of shadowed cellars, abandoned warehouses, and crumbling basements where gladiators discovered that their day's fame could be leveraged into far more dangerous and lucrative spectacles, arenas without rules, crowds without mercy, and stakes that made the Colosseum seem almost quaint by comparison, a subterranean world where the only thing more intoxicating than victory was the thrill of risking everything for a single night of notoriety, coin, and the kind of adulation that carried no civic oversight, only whispered respect, awe, and terror. These underground fights, often organized by shadowy brokers, tavern owners, or freedmen with taste for profit, were the true test of a gladiator's cunning, strength, and adaptability. For here, opponents were unpredictable, rules were malleable, and the consequences of failure were immediate and often brutal, with broken bones, permanent scars, and even death lurking just as readily as applause in the Colosseum, reminding every participant that survival was less about spectacle and more about instinct, improvisation, and the cold, calculated understanding that one misstep could end everything: life, reputation, and the delicate, precarious access to the pleasures that only notoriety could buy. The venues themselves were as varied as the gladiators who fought within them. Sometimes a basement beneath a bustling inn, thick with the stench of spilled wine, unwashed bodies, and sweat that clung to stone walls like an oppressive fog. Other times, an abandoned granary or warehouse, its wooden beams creaking ominously under the weight of spectators perched above the combatants like vultures awaiting the inevitable. The architecture itself amplifying the sense of danger, claustrophobia, and anticipation, turning every punch, stab, and maneuver into a performance that was simultaneously horrifying, exhilarating, and grotesquely intimate. Crowds were smaller than in the Colosseum, but no less passionate, composed of the city's most deviant patrons, gamblers seeking profit, criminals seeking entertainment, and opportunistic onlookers whose admiration came tinged with the thrill of witnessing violence unchecked by law, a demographic as varied as the weapons employed in these subterranean brawls, which ranged from fists and knives to improvised clubs, chains, and even spiked cudgels, each instrument of brutality chosen not just to subdue but to terrify, to display dominance, and to mark the loser with the stigma of having underestimated a man forged in the most unforgiving of crucibles. Gladiators, accustomed to the performative nature of the arena, adapted quickly, blending showmanship with survival instinct, calculating the exact moment to feint, strike, or retreat, reading both their opponent's body and the crowd's reaction with an almost predatory precision, understanding that unlike the public spectacle, here there were no referees, no mercy, and no guarantee that fortune would favor skill over cunning, luck, or sheer brutality, and that the slightest hesitation could result in not only injury but humiliation that followed a man far longer than any scar on flesh. These fights were not merely physical contests, they were psychological wars as well, battles of intimidation, reputation, and strategy, where a gladiator's fame acted as both weapon and shield, a currency of fear that could turn an opponent's hesitation into victory, a reminder that the art of combat extended beyond the arena into the shadows, where cunning, experience, and reputation could win battles that brute strength alone could not, and where the stakes were magnified by the knowledge that each fight carried consequences far more permanent than applause or coin. The risk of mutilation, of infection, or of a life ended before it had any chance to be celebrated by the world above. And yet, amid the darkness, the sweat, and the blood, there was an almost intoxicating sense of freedom, a thrill that no Colosseum could replicate, the knowledge that in these hidden arenas, gladiators were not constrained by imperial oversight, civic expectation, or choreographed rules, but could assert dominance, command fear, and experience danger in its purest, most primal form, a nocturnal crucible where the lessons of the arena were sharpened, twisted, and reimagined in ways that were as shocking as they were mesmerizing, a place where the human body and spirit were tested against both circumstance and desire, and where only the cleverest, strongest, and most audacious could emerge unscathed to navigate the shadows of Rome once more. Once the Colosseum gates had closed for the day, and the sun had slipped beneath the horizon, the so-called heroes of Rome often discovered that the city's underbelly held opportunities far more lucrative and infinitely more perilous than any bout staged for the screaming masses. A labyrinthine world of illicit trade, stolen goods, and black market dealings where muscle, reputation, and a single glinting scar could open doors that coin alone could never unlock, and where gladiators, trained for the choreography of death, applied the same precision and audacity to crimes that were calculated to yield wealth, influence, or simply the intoxicating thrill of power unbound by the law, a stark contrast to the regimented brutality of the arena, where their violence was public, sanctioned, and ultimately controlled. These nocturnal ventures into criminality were as varied as the gladiators themselves. Some acted as enforcers for unscrupulous merchants, their swords and fists ensuring debts were collected, bribes delivered, or competitors intimidated into submission, while others carved out more personal dominions, extorting protection money from taverns, gambling dens, and workshops, their presence alone a warning that resistance would be met with swift and merciless retaliation, an understanding reinforced by the subtle artistry of fear, honed over years of facing death before thousands, and then translating that intimidation into profit, obedience, or influence, in a world that rewarded audacity as much as skill. Yet crime was never merely a matter of intimidation. It was a theater of cunning, negotiation, and psychological manipulation, for gladiators were not mere brutes but skilled observers of human weakness, reading hesitation, greed, and desire with the same precision they once reserved for combatants in the arena, exploiting it to manipulate outcomes in their favor, turning a tavern quarrel into a profitable skirmish, a rival gang's boast into a trap, or a wealthy patron's fear into both coin and leverage. A dark, thrilling game, where every interaction carried the weight of risk and the tantalizing promise of reward. Some gladiators descended into theft, smuggling or fencing stolen goods, trading contraband with merchants and sailors who skirted the empire's regulations, and in doing so they became both predators and prey, as betrayal lurked around every corner. Alliances were fragile, and a single misstep could transform a lucrative venture into a fatal encounter, a lesson learned in blood that mirrored the very realities of the arena, where a miscalculated strike could end in death rather than victory, and where fame offered no immunity from the consequences of hubris or error. Others, more daring or reckless, entered the criminal networks that ran Rome's illicit entertainment, arranging unlicensed fights, underground spectacles, or illicit gambling rings, where fortunes changed hands on the roll of dice or the fall of a blade. and where each event carried the simultaneous thrill of risk and the horror of violence, creating a paradoxical existence in which gladiators were both entertainers and criminals, heroes to some, monsters to others, and always participants in a world that demanded a constant negotiation between survival, ambition, and morality, a negotiation that could never be paused or postponed. And yet, even amid the blood, shadows, and whispered threats of the criminal underworld, there was a peculiar sense of order, an unspoken hierarchy governed by reputation, fear, and the cold mathematics of advantage, in which gladiators learned which alliances were profitable, which enemies were dangerous, and which opportunities were worth risking everything, a lesson in survival that echoed the discipline of their training, yet diverged into a moral twilight, where the line between right and wrong was blurred, where loyalty could be bought or betrayed, and where every action carried consequences as sharp and immediate as any sword thrust in the arena's glaring sunlight. By night, gladiators who embraced this world moved with a predator's grace through the darkened streets of Rome, navigating criminal contracts, secret deals, and treacherous alliances with the same confidence they once displayed in the Colosseum, transforming their notoriety into a weapon, their skill into leverage, and their presence into both a warning and a promise, a chilling reminder that in the shadows of Rome, power was absolute, morality was negotiable, and the gladiators who survived these dual lives celebrated by day, feared by night, commanded a world far more dangerous, intoxicating, and morally complex than anything staged beneath the sunday. While the roar of the crowd faded and the scent of blood still clung to their skins, gladiators discovered that the arena was only the opening act of a far darker, more intoxicating performance, one played out not with swords, nets, or tridents, but with bodies, desire, and the unrelenting currency of sexual power, a game in which fame and fear were more potent aphrodisiacs than wine or perfume, and where the line between pleasure and exploitation blurred in ways that modern morality could scarcely comprehend without wincing. For the men and women who navigated these nocturnal rituals, every glance, every touch, every whispered suggestion was a weapon as precise and deadly as any blade wielded under the Colosseum's unforgiving Sunday. Roman society, with its obsession for spectacle and appetite for excess, had cultivated a peculiar fascination with the gladiator's body, taut, scarred, and hardened by daily combat. It was simultaneously a symbol of brutality and erotic allure, a living canvas upon which desire, fear, and fantasy collided, and gladiators learned early that their value extended beyond the cheers of the arena into clandestine encounters that promised pleasure, leverage, and influence in the shadowed corners of taverns, baths, and private chambers, where discretion was currency and reputation was both shield and temptation. Courtesans, prostitutes, and wealthy patrons alike sought the attention of gladiators not merely for carnal indulgence, but as a declaration of status, a silent acknowledgement that proximity to danger, skill, and notoriety was a mark of sophistication, daring, or madness, depending on who observed from the shadows. Some gladiators traded their favors for gold, protection, or political favor, orchestrating encounters with the precision of a fight choreography, while others surrendered to the chaos of lust, allowing desire to dictate actions that were reckless, intoxicating, and sometimes deadly, a fusion of seduction and strategy that mirrored the unpredictable dance of combat in the arena itself. The Colosseum's backstage, once the domain of trainers, attendants, and the occasional emperor's envoy, often became the stage for these exploits, where private chambers, hidden corridors, and the faint echoes of departure gates bore witness to clandestine liaisons as transgressive as they were erotic, and where gladiators could exert control in ways denied to ordinary citizens. A touch, a glance, or a whispered command could ignite desire, manipulate alliances, or incite jealousy, transforming simple attraction into a high-stakes gamble with consequences that rivaled the life or death stakes of their daytime battles. For some, the allure was purely hedonistic, nights spent in the company of willing partners, the sound of silk, laughter, and gasps blending with the faint, lingering memories of arena violence, a thrill intensified by the knowledge that the law, morality, and social expectation were all temporarily suspended under the cover of darkness, replaced by a hierarchy dictated by reputation, appetite, and the unspoken understanding that consent, coercion, and calculation were often entwined in a disturbing, intoxicating symphony. Others, however, exploited these sexual entanglements for survival or influence, forming strategic liaisons with patrons, officials, or rival gladiators, manipulating desires to secure protection, favors, or financial advantage, a practice as calculated and precise as any battle plan, where every touch, every murmur, every glance could shift loyalties, provoke vengeance, or elevate status, revealing that in the shadows of Rome, sex was as much a tool of power as the gladius, a weapon wielded with subtlety, skill, and a keen understanding of human weakness. Even the baths, ostensibly spaces for hygiene and leisure, were theaters for these nocturnal games, with steam, shadow, and warm water serving as both seduction and camouflage, a place where gladiators could indulge appetites, negotiate influence, and assert dominance, all while preserving the illusion of casual intimacy, an environment where control and chaos coexisted in a manner as shocking and thrilling as the roar of the Colosseum, reminding all involved that the gladiators' lives were never simple, never purely violent, and never devoid of the intoxicating complexities of desire, ambition, and human frailty. And so, as night deepened and the city's lamps cast flickering shadows on stone and flesh alike, gladiators moved through the sexual labyrinth of Rome with the same calculated audacity they had displayed in the arena, wielding beauty, danger, and notoriety as instruments of power, seduction, and survival, proving that their dominion extended far beyond the sands, into the realms of pleasure, manipulation, and moral ambiguity, where every encounter could be both paradise and trap, ecstasy and peril, a reminder that in the darkness, the gladiator's most potent weapon was often not the sword, but the body itself. After the roar of the Colosseum faded and the city's shadows stretched long over the cobbled streets, gladiators often sought refuge in the most insidious of Roman pleasures: drink, a liquid solace capable of numbing both memory and conscience, a vessel into which the day's bloodshed could be poured, diluted, or forgotten entirely, yet which carried its own perils, for in the hands of the reckless or the cleverly murderous, it could just as easily serve as a conduit for death, a bitter irony that gladiators, masters of life and death on the sand, were only human when it came to cups brimming with wine, honeyed mead, or concoctions that smelled like perfumed poison but tasted of temptation. Taverns and inns, already teeming with shadowed figures and whispered deals, became the laboratories of debauchery, where gladiators and citizens alike tested the limits of intoxication, not merely for amusement but as a weapon, a tool, a bargaining chip. While the wine flowed, so too did rumors, bribes, and plots, and even a simple toast could hide lethal intent, a subtle nod to the long history of Rome's fascination with slow, hidden death, where a drop of hemlock or aconite in the right goblet could topple fortunes, ruin reputations, and leave behind nothing but a corpse whose demise would be dismissed as unfortunate overindulgence. The connection between alcohol and poison was not coincidental. Gladiators, despite their prowess, were not immune to the treacheries of human cunning, and Rome's nocturnal social scene was as lethal as the arena itself. In dimly lit rooms, the scent of spiced wine mingled with sweat and smoke, a perfume of indulgence masking the latent menace, as men who had faced lions without flinching negotiated debts, manipulated lovers, and occasionally slipped substances into cups that promised pleasure but delivered destruction, a grim echo of the bloody precision they exhibited under the sun, now transformed into a subtler, more insidious game where observation, timing, and intimidation were the weapons of choice. For some gladiators, the combination of drink and poison was purely pragmatic, a means of self-preservation in a society that prized cruelty as much as courage. A poisoned goblet could serve as both deterrent and revenge, ensuring that rivals thought twice before encroaching on a gladiator's claim to fame, influence, or women, or as a method of eliminating those whose knowledge of secrets, debts, or scandals posed unacceptable risks. The cleverest among them mastered the balance of intoxication and threat, weaving an atmosphere where a single careless sip might result in bliss or sudden, unexpected death, a scenario that kept both allies and enemies perpetually on edge, reminding all present that life in Rome, much like in the Colosseum, demanded vigilance, cunning, and a certain appetite for risk. But not all poisonings were calculated. Many were the result of drunken folly, a hazard amplified by the gladiators' own appetites, which could lead to reckless wagers, misplaced trust, or sudden outbursts of violence, each cup a potential stage for disaster. As fists swung faster than reason, reputations shattered over spilled wine, and lives ended with the clatter of overturned goblets on stone floors, demonstrating that intoxication was as unpredictable as combat and as dangerous as the wild beasts they had faced just hours earlier. Beyond the taverns, elite villas offered gladiators more refined, yet equally lethal, forms of indulgence, lavish feasts where wine flowed like rivers, flavored with honey, herbs, or the faintest hint of toxins. Consumed amidst laughter, erotic performances, and whispered schemes, a decadent theater in which a misplaced word, a glance, or a raised cup could alter destinies in an instant, reminding even the strongest gladiator that mortality was not merely a product of the arena, but a constant companion in the perfumed, wine-stained corridors of Rome. And so, with each night of drinking and clandestine plotting, gladiators balanced the thrill of indulgence with the peril of death, learning, often too late, that in Rome, as in the arena, mastery over one's environment could mean survival, while a single lapse, an underestimated rival, a misread expression, a poisoned cup mistaken for harmless wine, could turn the evening's revelry into a funeral procession, a grim reminder that even the strongest, most feared warriors were never immune to the city's intoxicating blend of pleasure, deceit, and mortal peril. As the sun disappeared behind Rome's imposing skyline, leaving the city cloaked in shadows that seemed almost to hum with anticipation, gladiators, having survived the arena's merciless scrutiny, often turned their attention to subtler yet equally destructive nocturnal amusements, pranks, sabotage, and acts of petty cruelty designed to unsettle rivals, manipulate allies, or simply amuse themselves at someone else's expense. A form of entertainment that combined the thrill of danger with the intoxicating sense of power that only those who had danced with death could truly appreciate. A dangerous game where laughter and terror walked hand in hand like two dueling gladiators locked in an intimate, lethal embrace. The victims of these nocturnal shenanigans were frequently other gladiators, their own kind, whose reputations, relationships, or livelihoods could be undermined with a single well-timed trick, whether it was greasing the floor of a barracks to send an unsuspecting opponent sprawling, releasing vermin into sleeping quarters, or secretly tampering with weapons so that the next training session became a chaotic spectacle of minor injuries, startled yelps, and suppressed laughter. The perpetrators, watching from shadowed corners, savoring the combination of fear, embarrassment, and disbelief as their victims struggled to comprehend the cruelty hidden behind the camaraderie that often bound them. But these pranks were rarely innocent. They were rehearsed with the precision of a gladiatorial bout, designed to destabilize, provoke, or humiliate, and sometimes escalating into acts of outright sabotage, where subtle alterations to armor, the placement of sharp objects, or the contamination of food and water could have consequences far beyond bruised egos, introducing a sense of mortal danger that reminded all involved that Rome's fascination with spectacle extended into every corner of life, not just the arena, and that even the most trusted comrade could become an instrument of ruin with a few whispered words or a hidden hand. The motivation behind these nocturnal assaults on dignity and safety was rarely purely malicious. Often it was strategic, a way to establish dominance, test loyalty, or divert attention from one's own misdemeanors. A psychological war waged behind closed doors where alliances were fragile and every smile could conceal venom. As gladiators leveraged their knowledge of human fear, pride, and superstition to create chaos that served both amusement and survival. A reminder that in Rome, social cunning could be just as deadly as physical skill, and that a well-timed prank might carry consequences reaching far beyond the next morning's laughter. At times, these acts of sabotage involve civilians as well, whether drunken merchants, unwitting servants, or arrogant aristocrats who had insulted a gladiator in passing. Their streets and homes became the stage for subtle terror. A flicker of shadow here, a poisoned jest there. Each prank carefully designed to teach a lesson about power, vulnerability, and the fine line between entertainment and violence. As gladiators, ever conscious of the public's fascination with spectacle, extended the principles of the arena into everyday life, turning Rome itself into an elaborate, dangerous game where only the cunning and alert survived without permanent scars. Yet even in the chaos and cruelty, there was an artistry, a rhythm, a meticulousness that spoke to the gladiators' training and temperament. The same men who could face lions or fellow warriors without hesitation applied their skills to social manipulation, psychological warfare, and the orchestration of carefully crafted pranks that reflected both intelligence and depravity, a duality that fascinated and terrified onlookers, a testament to the adaptability of those who had been forged in the fires of the arena, but who found equally potent power in the shadows beyond it. And so, as night deepened over Rome, gladiators slipped through streets and corridors, executing pranks and acts of sabotage with the same precision they had once reserved for combat, leaving a trail of confusion, fear, and suppressed laughter in their wake. A vivid reminder that life beyond the sand was no less thrilling, dangerous, or morally ambiguous than the battles that had earned them fame, and that for those trained to survive on spectacle, every shadow, every whispered secret, and every unsuspecting victim was a stage on which to demonstrate that the theater of cruelty extended far beyond the Colosseum's sun-baked stones. As the last echoes of the Colosseum's cheers faded into Rome's night, gladiators, their bodies still glistening with the sheen of blood, sweat, and the unmistakable grime of human conflict, stepped into a world where blades were replaced by gold coins, whispers, and favors, a labyrinthine network of patronage and corruption where the rules were unwritten, morality optional, and the difference between survival and ruin was as fragile as the thread of a senator's temper or the loyalty of a praetor nursing a grudge. A place where influence could be wielded as effectively as any gladius, and where a single miscalculation, a poorly timed word, or an unguarded glance could turn fame into ignominy faster than a lion's leap from the arena floor, leaving a man as powerless and exposed as a gladiator who had misjudged the bite of a spiked net. Patrons came in a bewildering variety of temperament, wealth, and intent, some ostentatious, draped in silk and marble, throwing banquets that glittered like the sun on the Tiber, yet often hiding an equally ruthless disposition beneath their cultivated charm. Others operated in shadowed corridors, their power invisible but absolute, orchestrating deals and betrayals with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, where a mislaid favor could ripple through Rome's social and political circles with deadly consequences. For a gladiator, securing the right patron could mean protection from enemies, access to the city's most decadent pleasures, or even influence in civic and political matters that the average citizen could not dream of. Yet missteps and insult, a forgotten promise, or misplaced loyalty could invite ruin, imprisonment, or death, penalties far more permanent than the applause of a bloodthirsty crowd or the fleeting accolades of a day in the arena. Corruption in Rome was both art and weapon, a theater of manipulation as intricate and dangerous as any choreographed fight. Bribes ranged from small tokens, coins slipped into an unsuspecting hand, favors owed in silence, to elaborate machinations involving fixed matches, falsified debts, or carefully constructed rumors designed to ensnare rivals and fracture alliances. Information was currency, and those who controlled it wielded a power as lethal as a trained retiarius in the arena. A single whispered secret could topple reputations, provoke violence, or transform allies into enemies in the blink of an eye. Gladiators, quick to adapt and as cunning as any senator, understood that surviving the night required the same vigilance, strategic thinking, and cold calculation that had kept them alive under the midday sun. Though here the dangers were subtler, the stakes no less lethal, and the opponents far less predictable. Yet within this morally murky landscape, opportunity thrived. Gladiators with charisma, wit, and an instinct for manipulation became invaluable to patrons who sought to assert dominance over rivals, control votes in the Senate, or sway public opinion through strategic gossip. A game that demanded both performance and intelligence, where a joke, a glance, or a discreetly dropped coin could tilt the balance of power. These favored gladiators enjoyed privileges beyond the reach of ordinary citizens: invitations to private villas dripping with wine and indulgence, insights into political intrigues that shaped the empire, and fleeting authority over others who might otherwise scorn them, proving that fame, combined with cunning, could bend even Rome's rigid hierarchy to one's advantage. Danger, of course, remained constant. One misjudged word, one slight to the wrong noble, or failure to deliver on a promise could unravel carefully built alliances, transforming opportunity into catastrophe, a cruel echo of the arena's lethal math, where a single misstep meant death. Gladiators learned quickly that power in Rome was ephemeral, and that survival required an almost predatory ability to read intentions, exploit weaknesses, and anticipate treachery before it arrived, a skill as honed and terrifying as their mastery of the gladius. Night after night, gladiators navigated this perilous underworld, balancing fear, ambition, pleasure, and self-preservation with a precision rivaling their arena technique, knowing that corruption was both sword and shield, that loyalty was fragile, and that influence was a commodity as fickle as the crowd's favor. By the time dawn approached, those who survived the intricate dance of patronage had not only earned wealth and power, but also gained an intimate understanding of Rome's dark heartbeat, that the most dangerous fights were often fought, not in the blinding light of the Colosseum, but in shadowed halls where every coin, whisper, and favor could decide life, death, or eternal disgrace, and where the faintest misstep could leave a man broken, abandoned, or worse, swallowed whole by the very empire he had once served. Beneath the polished marble and gilded domes of Rome, far from the cheers, blood, and dust of the Colosseum, gladiators discovered a world that was invisible to the ordinary citizen, a clandestine network of secret societies, brotherhoods, and shadowed alliances where loyalty was currency, oaths were ironclad, and the consequences of betrayal could be more immediate and fatal than any sword strike delivered in the arena's glaring light. A nocturnal Rome where allegiances were forged in whispers, rituals, and mutual complicity, and where the rules of survival, like the rules of combat, were merciless and unforgiving. These brotherhoods, sometimes formal, often informal, operated on the principle that the collective strength of the many could protect the individual from both the law and the ever-present danger posed by rival factions, senators, and opportunistic citizens alike. Initiation into these societies was never a casual affair. It demanded displays of courage, cunning, and cruelty that often mirrored or even exceeded the gladiatorial feats performed under the midday sun, a test to determine whether a man could be trusted with secrets that, if exposed, could destroy reputations, families, or entire estates. The rituals were as elaborate as they were terrifying, blending symbolic gestures, blood oaths, and clandestine ceremonies performed under torchlight in forgotten cellars, abandoned temples, or the secreted corners of wealthy patrons' villas, places where the air was thick with incense, sweat, and the sense that the world beyond these walls did not exist, or if it did, it was irrelevant. Within these societies, gladiators found both protection and peril, a paradoxical mixture that heightened every heartbeat and sharpened every instinct. Allies were not always friends. They were assets, pawns, and sometimes predators waiting for the right moment to strike. Trust was a fragile, carefully negotiated contract, and the Code of Brotherhoods was enforced with the same brutal efficiency as the arena itself. Disloyalty could be punished with humiliation, exile, or death, while acts of loyalty and cunning could elevate a man from obscurity to a position of influence, granting him access to the secrets and strategies that controlled Rome's nocturnal power structure. Some of these societies functioned like protective guilds, offering shelter, information, and occasionally weaponry or funds for those who had fallen out of favor or were hunted by enemies. Whether rival gladiators, corrupt magistrates, or vengeful patrons, a safety net that was both literal and symbolic, a testament to the city's layered, ruthless, and often invisible systems of power. Others, however, were predatory, operating as criminal syndicates where gladiators were enlisted or coerced into theft, sabotage, and assassination, exploiting their fame, skill, and physical prowess in ways that the public could never have imagined, transforming once celebrated performers into the city's most lethal shadows. The Brotherhoods also served another, more psychological function. They created a sense of belonging in a life otherwise defined by death, spectacle, and transient fame. Here, gladiators could share their fears, secrets, and ambitions, finding solace in the knowledge that others had survived, endured, and even thrived in the same environment where terror, betrayal, and mortality were constant companions. Within these societies, camaraderie coexisted with suspicion, and loyalty was measured not by sentiment, but by action, by the ability to navigate Rome's dangerous nighttime ecosystem with skill, cunning, and occasionally, ruthless efficiency. Yet for all the protection and opportunity these societies offered, they were also a constant reminder that the streets of Rome were a stage, and every player gladiator, patrician, and thief alike was performing a role dictated as much by necessity as desire. The alliances forged in secret corridors were delicate and precarious. The brotherhoods existed in a tension between cooperation and competition, between friendship and exploitation, where a single misstep could unravel carefully constructed bonds, leaving a man exposed to the same merciless fates he had narrowly survived in the Colosseum. And so, as night draped its velvet cloak over Rome, and the torchlight flickered against stone walls, gladiators moved through this hidden network, balancing trust and treachery, courage and cunning, knowing that survival in the dark was a different art from survival in the arena, a dangerous, intoxicating dance where loyalty was both weapon and shield, and where the true test of a man's skill was not only how he fought, but how he lived when no one was watching. The Colosseum's roar had long since died, leaving the streets of Rome slick with night rain and the invisible residue of bloodshed, a city where shadows hid more than pickpockets and prostitutes, and where the sharp edge of a dagger was as ubiquitous as the clatter of sandals on cobblestones. For gladiators, the arena's lessons in life and death were merely a prelude to the far murkier, far more personal battles waged after sunset, a world where murder was not spectacle but survival, and revenge not entertainment but necessity, a grim calculus in which honor, insult, and ambition collided in a bloody, unpredictable theater that no magistrate or emperor could fully control. Acts of vengeance often began as whispers in taverns or through the faintest ripple of gossip along the forum, invisible to the untrained eye yet explosive in their consequences. A slight, real or imagined, against a gladiator's reputation could metastasize into a vendetta more enduring than any physical wound received in the arena, a personal war fought not with nets or tridents, but with poison, blades, and strategy, each maneuver calculated with the precision of a gladiator's strike, yet infinitely more unpredictable, because human emotion, unlike the rules of combat, obeyed no code. Some murders were spur-of-the-moment eruptions, ignited by drunken disputes over money, women, or perceived slights. The streets running red not from the orchestrated spectacle of public games, but from private rage, a chaos that left the city's citizens trembling and whispering, fearful of stepping into the wrong alley or catching the gaze of a man who had already killed once and would do so again without hesitation. Other killings, however, were slow, deliberate, and methodical, long-planned affairs executed with a patience that rivaled the most disciplined strategists of the Senate. A poisoned goblet, a staged accident in the back alleys, or a carefully manipulated brawl could end a life with elegance, invisibility, and impunity, leaving the killer celebrated in secret circles while the public remained blissfully unaware. Revenge, for gladiators, was a sacred and almost ritualistic undertaking, a continuation of the combat they had performed in the Colosseum, but elevated to an intensely personal dimension where the opponent knew every potential weakness, every scar, every hesitation. A gladiator wronged by a rival or betrayed by a patron could spend months or years preparing for a single act of retribution, orchestrating it with precision, timing it for maximum effect, ensuring that the outcome would be as psychologically devastating as it was physically lethal. The blood spilled was both literal and symbolic, a reaffirmation of dominance, an assertion that in a city as sprawling and corrupt as Rome, insults could not go unanswered, and betrayal could never be ignored. Yet revenge was rarely simple or satisfying. A successful act of vengeance often triggered another, a cycle of retaliation that could spiral into feuds spanning years, entangling allies, families, and innocents. A network of violence that stretched far beyond the original grievance, leaving the city awash in fear and suspicion. Gladiators had to balance instinct, timing, and strategy with the ever-present danger of escalation, recognizing that a single miscalculation could turn the hunter into the hunted, and that death was always waiting for those who misjudged the delicate arithmetic of vengeance. In these nocturnal skirmishes, morality was a distant concept, overshadowed by necessity, ambition, and survival. Loyalty was purchased in blood, fear was currency, and respect was enforced with the same ruthlessness as a deadly strike in the arena. A constant reminder that while Rome celebrated gladiators as entertainers, the real theater existed in the shadows, where the most consequential battles were fought not before cheering crowds but in silence, secrecy, and the cold, unforgiving embrace of night. By dawn, streets that had witnessed whispers, scheming, and bloodshed would appear calm, the chaos buried beneath commerce and the early chatter of citizens. Yet those who survived knew the truth. The games did not end when the Colosseum emptied, that every act of murder or revenge carried the weight of history, ego, and survival, and that the skill of a gladiator was measured not just by victories over lions or men, but by the ability to navigate the city's dark heart, where every shadow held a threat, and every breath could be one's last. When the sun had fled Rome, and the Colosseum's stones cooled beneath a waning moon, some gladiators found themselves fleeing not for glory, not for applause, but for survival. A desperate exodus through alleys slick with rain and grime, past shadowed markets and abandoned temples, where the echo of their own footsteps seemed almost louder than the memory of blood still clinging to their skin. A grim reminder that fame was a double-edged sword, adored by the masses by day, hunted by enemies and betrayed by friends by night. The thrill of the arena, with its predictable rules and the roar of the crowd, offered a strange comfort in comparison to the unpredictable chaos of being pursued through Rome's labyrinthine streets, where every corner could conceal a rival, a debtor with a knife, or a magistrate's enforcer eager to claim reward for the capture of a runaway star of the games. Escape required the same combination of brute force, cunning, and instinct that had kept them alive in the arena, yet the challenges were magnified. No spectators to cheer mistakes, no shields of armor except the night itself, no referees to halt an unfair attack. A gladiator on the run had to navigate a city that was simultaneously familiar and hostile, reading the intentions of citizens whose allegiance could shift with the flash of a coin, a whisper, or the promise of vengeance. Roofs became highways, sewers became highways of refuge, and every shadow offered both protection and peril, a constant reminder that Rome, for all its marble temples and imperial grandeur, was a hunting ground as merciless as the sands of the arena. and far less forgiving. Some fled the consequences of personal vendettas, rivals whose bruised pride or shattered plans demanded blood. The stakes escalated beyond mere insult to life and death calculations, a deadly arithmetic in which speed, knowledge of the streets, and improvisation were as crucial as the strength of one's arm or the precision of a dagger. Others were escaping the more insidious snare of patronage gone wrong. Noblemen or magistrates, who had once offered protection now seeking to eliminate a liability. A gladiator who had outlived usefulness or dared to defy expectations, and who now learned, far too late, that favor in Rome was volatile, temporary, and often lethal. Flight also demanded psychological endurance. Fear could not be allowed to paralyze, hesitation could not be tolerated, and every misstep might be the last. Gladiators relied on improvisation honed through years of staged combat, translating their knowledge of timing, positioning, and reading opponents into an urban battlefield, where a broken cart or a narrow passage could become a choke point, a trap, or a salvation, depending entirely on skill, luck, and the unpredictability of human behavior. Informants and allies could turn into predators, friends into betrayers, and the city itself seemed to conspire against those who dared to move against its invisible currents. Each street and corridor, a gauntlet where both skill and nerve were tested to their limits. Yet, amid the terror and uncertainty, some gladiators discovered exhilaration, a perverse thrill in the dance between pursuit and evasion, a dark counterpart to the adrenaline of combat in front of cheering crowds. The night became an arena of shadows, where cleverness and courage could mean survival, and mistakes could mean death. Yet those who mastered the art of flight found themselves transformed, their senses sharpened, their perception of danger recalibrated, and their understanding of Rome's underbelly expanded beyond the reach of any ordinary citizen. By dawn, those who survived the night's pursuit often emerged changed, aware that glory was fleeting, fame could be fatal, and that the city's heartbeat was measured not by chariot races or gladiatorial games, but by the silent, shadowed struggle of those who ran beneath its streets, hunted and haunted, alive only through a mixture of instinct, brutality, and cunning, a testament to the fact that the life of a gladiator extended far beyond the arena into a nocturnal world of fear, strategy, and survival that was at once more dangerous, more morally ambiguous, and infinitely more revealing of human nature than any battle fought before the crowds of the Colosseum. As night blanketed Rome and the echoes of gladiatorial combat faded from the Colosseum, a different stage came alive, one far removed from the cheers of the commoners and the predictable choreography of death. The private villas and palaces of the city's elite, where wealth could transform cruelty into performance and morality into optional decoration. A world where gladiators were not just killers but instruments of spectacle, pleasure, and intimidation, summoned to amuse, to shock, and sometimes to punish, all at the whim of men and women whose power rivaled the emperor's own, yet whose appetites were as capricious as the Tiber's floodwaters. In these gilded chambers, the line between admiration and exploitation blurred, and a single glance from a wealthy patron could shift a gladiator from idol to commodity, celebrated one moment and discarded the next, a terrifying reminder that even the most feared warrior was ultimately subject to someone else's whims. These elite entertainments were an orchestra of indulgence, cruelty, and spectacle, where exotic foods, perfumed wine, and servants moved in synchrony with the desires of the hosts, creating an intoxicating environment in which gladiators performed not with swords, but with presence, charisma, and the subtle application of fear. Some patrons demanded staged fights within private arenas, miniature echoes of the Colosseum, where the audience's amusement was measured in applause, gasps, or the faintest hint of panic, and where failure could cost more than pride, it could cost life, reputation, or the wrath of a vengeful nobleman. Others preferred subtler forms of entertainment, wrestlers murmuring their bodies across the polished floors, or demonstrations of brute strength against exotic animals smuggled into secret gardens, a spectacle designed not to display skill, but to remind guests that wealth could bend even death itself to human whim. Gladiators were both performers and pawns, their skill in the arena transformed into a currency of influence, a way to curry favor, manipulate social hierarchies, or negotiate alliances through presence alone. Courtesans, politicians, and senators watched with veiled fascination, drinking in every movement, every controlled gesture, understanding that power extended beyond gold and armies into the manipulation of desire and fear, and that those gladiators who could navigate these perilous waters became more than entertainers. They became symbols, embodiments of life and death, stakes made intimate, personal, and deliciously scandalous. Yet these nights were not without peril. A misstep in etiquette, a refusal to participate in an unwanted act, or a gesture interpreted as disrespect could ignite fury, turning admiration into wrath, and transforming a gladiator from prized spectacle into hunted prey. Rumors spread faster than chariots through Rome's elite corridors. Reputations could be shattered by a single whispered accusation, and even the slightest betrayal could bring ruin. In such a volatile environment, cunning became as valuable as combat skill, and every encounter demanded an acute awareness of human desire, vanity, and the unpredictable volatility of wealth combined with unchecked power. The indulgences of the elite also revealed the darkest aspects of human nature: lust twisted by status, cruelty disguised as amusement, and the satisfaction of control as intoxicating as wine or opium. Gladiators witnessed Baroque excesses that blurred the line between spectacle and atrocity, from elaborate mock executions to contests of strength designed purely to assert dominance over a rival, to games that toyed with mortality in ways that would horrify the populace if ever revealed. The veneer of civility offered by marble floors and silk drapery did little to hide the raw, often horrifying instincts of those who wielded influence with a flick of a hand, a whispered suggestion, or the summoning of a blade-wielding performer from the arena. By dawn, gladiators emerged from these nights transformed and exhausted, carrying the residue of both fear and fascination, aware that the entertainment of the elite demanded not only skill and courage but diplomacy, perception, and the ability to survive in a world where admiration and danger were indistinguishable, and where a single misstep could undo years of hard-won fame, turning applause into silence, indulgence into threat, and curiosity into vengeance. A chilling reminder that for Rome's most powerful, life was always a game, and gladiators were among its most dangerous and most disposable players. Long after the Colosseum fell silent, when the sun had bled behind the rooftops of Rome, and only the occasional torch flickered in shadowed streets, the arena's echoes lingered like a disease, infecting both the living and the memories of the dead. These were not spirits in the childish sense, nor were they the dramatic wraiths whispered about by tavern patrons to scare children. They were the psychological phantoms of combat, the residual terror and exhilaration embedded into the minds and bodies of gladiators who had stared at death and survived, only to discover that survival did not grant freedom. It granted a permanent audience of ghosts that refused to leave. Every scar, every twitch of muscle, every phantom scream was a reminder that the Colosseum's brutality was not a spectacle that ended when the gates closed. It followed its champions into the alleys, the villas, and the dimly lit corners of Rome's nocturnal life. For the gladiators, the night became a theater for memories that were both intimate and horrifying. In quiet taverns, where the wine reeked of sour grapes and old sweat, or in damp alleyways that smelled of urine, rot, and mildew, a sudden clatter, or a stranger's laughter, could transport them back to the sands of the arena. They relived the snap of a net, the roar of a lion, the metallic tang of blood on their lips, the horrifying thrill of watching a comrade fall with a final, gurgling scream while the crowd roared in grotesque ecstasy. These recollections were relentless, unbidden, and vivid, like shadows that crawled over the city itself, entwining past and present, so that a simple step down a familiar street became a negotiation with unseen danger, and every passerby seemed momentarily transformed into a potential predator, a rival, or a witness to a forgotten atrocity. Even when gladiators sought fleeting pleasures, wine, women, gambling, the ghosts intruded. Lovers recoiled at the twitch of a hand, patrons sensed the tension before a fight broke out, and the men themselves moved with the caution of predators, aware that hesitation could save life, but overconfidence could invite death. Memory became both ally and tormentor, sharpening instincts while gnawing at the soul. A reminder that the Colosseum's arena was not merely a stage of flesh and steel, but a crucible that burned itself into consciousness, leaving survivors haunted even when the crowds had gone. Some attempted to ward off these ghosts. Coins were tossed into fountains as offerings, obscure charms inscribed on skin or tucked beneath clothing, and whispered prayers to gods or spirits filled the air with a tremulous hope that the past could be negotiated. Others exploited the hauntings, cultivating the fear they inspired, using tales of spectral allies or deadly curses to intimidate rivals or charm patrons. Ghosts became an extension of reputation, a psychological weapon as potent as a sword, as manipulative as any patron's favor, as dangerous as the treacherous streets of Rome after dark. By the dim light of dawn, the phantoms receded into the city's stones, leaving an imprint that was both subtle and brutal. A mind conditioned to terror, a body attuned to sudden violence, and a constant awareness that life after the arena was never free of peril. The Colosseum had taught them to survive the visible, but the invisible battles against memory, fear, and the lingering presence of death were the true test. The ghosts of the arena were everywhere, and their influence was enduring. A reminder that the most horrifying opponents were not always alive, that some victories were never final, and that every shadowed corner of Rome might conceal the echo of a scream, the glint of steel, or the relentless gaze of a dead man who refused to be forgotten. In this city of stone, blood, and secrets, the living and the dead danced together, a macabre waltz in which survival meant negotiation with the past, understanding that the Colosseum's lessons extended far beyond its walls, that its shadows reached into every nocturnal corner, and that the ghosts of the arena were more cunning, more patient, and more terrifying than any living foe could ever be. When the Colosseum emptied and the roar of bloodthirsty spectators faded into the labyrinthine streets of Rome, a different kind of battle began for the gladiators. One fought not with gladii or tridents, but with whispers, favors, and coin. This was the dark economy, a shadow network where influence could buy survival, fear became currency, and every interaction carried the potential for profit or sudden brutal ruin. Unlike the arena, where danger was immediate and visible, the threats of Rome's underworld were subtle, invisible, and infinitely more insidious. A misjudged word, a forgotten obligation, or a misplaced act of loyalty could undo even the most celebrated champion in an instant, leaving him exposed to revenge, humiliation, or death, far from the audience's cheering eyes. A silent punishment that struck with the cold precision of a well-aimed dagger. Gladiators quickly learned that the city's night had its own rules, often unwritten, always lethal. Taverns, brothels, and hidden gambling dens operated as miniature arenas of power, where physical prowess was sometimes useful, but cunning, charm, and strategic intimidation mattered far more. A skilled fighter could leverage his reputation to enforce debts, intimidate rivals, or mediate disputes for patrons who preferred plausible deniability, their hands clean, while gladiators executed the subtle violence of leverage. Coins were exchanged for favors, secrets bartered for protection, and loyalty was a fragile commodity. The price of miscalculation was always immediate and often irreversible. In this world, survival demanded vigilance, strategy, and a cold understanding that in Rome's shadows, the strongest did not always win, the cleverest did, and sometimes the luckiest. Patrons formed the spine of this economy, offering protection, access, or influence in exchange for service, obedience, or carefully negotiated risk. Some were ostentatious, flaunting wealth in villas dripping with wine, perfumes imported from the far reaches of the empire, and mosaics glinting like jewels under candlelight, while others operated in silence, manipulating events from the shadows, directing the fates of gladiators as subtly as a puppeteer tugs at strings, their intentions inscrutable and often deadly. For the gladiator, securing a powerful patron could mean wealth, freedom, or social leverage, but one misstep, a slight insult, a broken promise, or failure to carry out a task could transform opportunity into ruin. A whisper of disloyalty, a rumor twisted by envious rivals, or even an unguarded glance could become a weapon, turning the very networks that promised safety into instruments of destruction. Information became a currency as valuable as gold. Gladiators who mastered the dark economy learned to read the subtleties of gossip, alliances, and enmity, discovering that a single secret could topple reputations, provoke violence, or shift the balance of power in favor of the clever. They were brokers of influence, intermediaries between patricians, merchants, and criminals, trading knowledge, protection, and favors with the precision of a gladiator's strike. The interplay of fear, desire, and ambition created a dangerous equilibrium, a system in which the same skill that kept a man alive in the arena, anticipation, timing, and ruthless calculation, dictated his fate in the city's unseen theaters, where shadows concealed knives, betrayal, and opportunity in equal measure. Even commerce and crime were intertwined, forming a shadow economy that demanded participation. Gambling dens, illicit markets, and underground fighting pits depended on gladiators as enforcers, negotiators, or symbols of strength. Every coin exchanged, every favor owed, and every strategic threat reinforced a hierarchy where cunning, reputation, and timing mattered as much as raw physical strength. The dark economy was unforgiving. Misjudgments were costly. Betrayal was inevitable, and survival required constant awareness. Yet for those who could navigate its treacherous pathways, Rome offered freedom, influence, and power that even the most celebrated arena victories could never match. A dangerous intoxication that lured even the most disciplined gladiators into moral compromises they would never confess. In the end, the dark economy was more than survival. It was an arena of its own, invisible but no less deadly, where every decision carried weight, every alliance was conditional, and every whispered secret could determine life or death. Gladiators, trained in endurance, precision, and strategy, adapted seamlessly, transforming the skills honed in daylight battles into weapons of night, mastering a world where the rules were fluid, danger ubiquitous, and the rewards, like all of Rome, glittering, intoxicating, and fleeting, a cruel parody of the public spectacle that had once made them heroes in the eyes of thousands, yet now demanded a far more subtle, far deadlier kind of mastery. As the sun sank beneath the terracotta roofs of Rome, leaving the Colosseum to cast long, sinister shadows over the city, the gladiators stepped into a world that thrived not on applause, but on fear, lust, and whispered transactions, a nocturnal kingdom where the rules of the arena were replaced by subtler, far more insidious ones, and where life could be snatched away with the same casual cruelty as a spilled goblet of wine. By day, they were celebrated as icons of courage, skill, and spectacle. But when night fell, their fame became a beacon for predators of every stripe: thieves, schemers, corrupt officials, and ambitious patrons, all seeking to exploit the unique combination of muscle, reputation, and moral ambiguity that these men carried like an invisible armor, fragile yet terrifyingly effective. The city transformed into an arena of shadows, alleys narrowing into traps, and taverns doubling as theaters of negotiation, deception, and sudden violence, each step forward measured against the probability of survival. Some gladiators vanished into the labyrinth of streets, blending with merchants, prostitutes, and beggars, as though trained to disappear, their fame hidden beneath cloaks, dampened with sweat and the grime of exertion. Others sought indulgence in brothels, scented with perfumes both exotic and overpowering, where the lines between pleasure, coercion, and transaction blurred to the point that lust and strategy became indistinguishable, and every embrace carried unspoken obligations, debts, and threats, an eroticized version of the arena's lethal choreography. In these rooms, Power was exercised quietly, reputations leveraged like currency, and betrayal was as likely to be delivered with a glance as with a blade, a subtle violence that demanded constant vigilance and a relentless hunger for control. Underground fighting pits and illicit gambling dens became nightly proving grounds, echoing the brutality of the Colosseum but scaled to a level invisible to magistrates, where fortunes changed with the roll of dice, the swing of a fist, or the sudden betrayal of an ally. Here, the same tactical instincts that allowed a man to survive a lion's leap or a netted entrapment became essential, as every wager, every calculated intimidation, and every strategic retreat could mean the difference between wealth, humiliation, or death. The gladiators' bodies, already honed to endure excruciating strain, were now instruments of negotiation, intimidation, and performance, their every movement a careful balance between threat and display, seduction and intimidation, life and oblivion. Corruption and patronage, already potent during the day, intensified at night. Wealthy citizens, senators, and even the occasional praetor relied on gladiators as intermediaries, enforcers, and symbols of influence, offering protection, coin, or political leverage in exchange for services rendered with a combination of physical intimidation and social cunning. A single misstep, a failure to deliver a message, an insult uttered at the wrong moment, a hidden debt exposed could erase weeks of carefully cultivated favor and turn allies into deadly enemies, a truth that weighed heavily on men whose lives had long been defined by the brutal calculus of risk and reward. Survival depended on anticipation, observation, and an almost preternatural ability to read both intentions and weaknesses. Skills honed in the arena but sharpened to a razor's edge by the shadows of the city. And yet, amid the predation, the deals, and the clandestine violence, there was a perverse exhilaration, a thrill born of existing beyond the rigid rules of spectacle, of bending power, reputation, and fear to one's own will, even if only temporarily. Rome at night consumed its gladiators, stripping away public adoration to leave only those qualities necessary to navigate darkness, deception, and the unpredictable human appetites that had no audience to cheer or condemn. In this unseen arena, every choice, every movement, every whispered word mattered as much as any maneuver in the Colosseum, and the men who survived were those who adapted fastest, calculated ruthlessly, and recognized that fear, not applause, was the currency of night. As dawn threatened the horizon, the city slowly exhaled, and the gladiators, bodies bruised, spirits taxed, and reputations both bolstered and imperiled, vanished once again into anonymity, carrying with them the lessons, scars, and moral compromises of the night. A stark reminder that for every hero celebrated under the sun, there existed a darker self, consumed by the shadows, thriving in the chaos, and bound forever to Rome's insatiable appetite for blood, power, and spectacle.